I told all the coaches it's super dangerous. Please don't let her. Don't let her do that. I mean, like, yeah, I suppose. I don't know. It's like vaguely in my mind. I was like, I can put that right into it. Because he was like, yeah, because it was weird. He was like, yeah, he said that right. But so much happens sometimes. I'm like, there's too much in there. Yeah. I don't even know what the word is going to say. Gotta be better than the 63 I got last night. Was it a 62 this morning? I got a 64. What did I say? So I'm glad I took it. How did you go? Where it's just, oh my gosh, that's because my first exam, like last semester, it was like 86. I'm like, okay, not bad. And I went down to
No, every time they speak the same
percentage too.
these are all big.
You're like even like with bonus questions.
That's a size 6?
I think
Yeah,
so.
I just saw the slide about it, so now I'm curious.
This is a 6, but it's actually kind of big on me. But I think I don't know if this one's 10. This one's kind of 10. I think this one's like sizes. Yeah, I think this one's a 7.
I just saw a slide in the presentation about a dude that was 25.
How's that even happen? Why would you even get a ring at that point?
That's 4.
Wow. It's like, how is his fingers? That's a bracelet at that point. Yeah. It's a necklace. Jeez.
Okay, we're ready. I'll go ahead and get started.
I'm gonna talk right now. Live stream, don't freak out.
So, my goals for today, finish chapter 5, and then also give you some direction as far as the exam on Wednesday. So the exam on Wednesday is over chapters 3 and 4, and the review activity should help a lot with concepts. So you'll be given the formulas and the numbers. You just have to know how to use the formulas. And then this activity is more on concepts from chapters 3 and 4. So do you have any questions? Okay, all right, so let's begin. We've been talking about torque. So torque is equal to two things, right? The product of force and moment arm, right? So that makes a difference in terms of how muscles are activated and which area of the body is experiencing more stress. To apply that concept, if we look at forces, especially at the low back and the knee joint during a squat, this is a study that back in 2003 from University of Memphis that looked at restriction of forward knee movement. So thinking critically, is restricting forward knee movement of the knees always a good thing? No, it's not. So here would be, actually this is a colleague of mine, Brian Schilling, who's at the University of Memphis, but this would be a typical squat, typical deep squat without restriction of forward knee movement. So the big concern, especially in commercial settings, would have to do with excessive shear type force at the knee joint. So a shear type force is like frictional force within the joint capsule. So there's concern over wearing down cartilage in the knee joint. Cartilage has a poor ability to regenerate, and so excessive amounts of shear force, or really any type of force, is not good for tissue. So tissue, like cartilage, has certain limits. And with exercise, the goal of creating an overload is to keep the forces within reasonable limits. So an overload is something that we're not accustomed to. If we go too far, we can incur damage. And so we want the overload to be within limits that our bodies can adapt to and change. And so we get thickening of cartilage within the knee joint with proper overload and recovery. So the recovery part is really, really important, because that's when tissue builds and gets stronger. So shear force is not a bad thing. It's a part of normal movement, especially with deep squat angles. You're going to have shear at the spine, shear at the knee joint. With the deep squat, it's really difficult not to have the knees go forward to the toes, but what we want is to keep that within reasonable limits. So for someone that has no pre-existing knee issues, a deep squat is not going to harm the knee joints, but we still need to be careful that we're not exceeding the limits, and so we have to pay attention to recovery as well. So in this case, when we put a piece of plywood in front of the knees and ask to achieve the same range of motion at the hip, there's a trade-off between shear stress at the knee and shear stress at the spine, right? Especially the lumbar area. So restricting forward movement of the knee would place greater compensatory shear stress within the lumbar region of the spine. So probably not a good thing. So we want to squat based on our structure. Some people naturally have the structure to squat a little bit deeper than others, but we don't want to abnormally or on purpose restrict the forward movement of the knee joint, because that's how the knee joint moves during a squat exercise. So you can see the difference in moment arm there. Same amount of weight, but the moment arm acting from the weight to the lumbar region of the spine would be greater. So that would create greater torque for that area. Okay, so we have lots of muscles in the forearms. So we have 6 on each side, 6 that are involved with flexion of the wrist and fingers, 6 that are involved with extension of the wrist and fingers. This is looking at the extensor side, so the posterior side of the forearm. Looking at a few examples here, the extensor carpi, radialis, brevis, and longus, which have their attachment points on the thumb side. So the extensor carpi ulnaris has its attachment there on the side of the 5th digit. So a few of the key extensors of the wrist joint. So how many can relate to this picture? Yeah, so you get a load of groceries, and yeah, my wife looks at me and just shakes her head because I do that every single time we go to the store. It's like, okay, Costco bags, and he's got cornflakes there, so you better be eating those cornflakes. But the whole point of this is muscle torque varies based on the muscle, based on the angle at the wrist. So this reflects the angle at the wrist. So when we're on this side, we're going more into extension. So for the wrist is like this, we're going into this side, that reflects more extension. Whereas this side over here represents more flexion. Okay? So the idea is that the extensor carpi radialis brevis, longus, extensor carpi ulnaris, they produce differing amounts of torque based on the angle at the wrist. So you can see with the wrist in hyperextension on this side versus the wrist in flexion on this side, the torque varies with each muscle. It's not the same. So there's not one wrist angle at which all 3 muscles produce the highest torque. So looking at this, it looks like the radialis brevis and longus produce the greatest torque with the wrist a little bit more in flexion. You can see on this side of the line, and then the highest level is achieved with the wrist more in flexion, whereas the extensor carpi ulnaris, it achieves its highest torque just a little bit with the wrist hyperextended. And so we can see this side of the line is extending the wrist a little bit more, and that's where we achieve the greatest movement range. So muscles vary in where they produce the greatest torque in any given range of motion. So that has to do with attachment points that determine the moment arm, because the attachment point determines the distance to the joint axis. Okay, so pole vault, great example of a movement. It requires a lot of skill, and we apply torque to the pole. And so there are two torques in this case. Okay, the axis happens to be the center of mass of the body. So the overall balance point around which the mass of the body is equally balanced and distributed. And so in each case, whether it's this force or this force, both of these forces are applied at a certain distance from the rotation point of the body, from the center of mass or center of gravity. And so both of these torques have a tendency to rotate the body in this clockwise direction. So to get the overall sum of torque, it's really easy. We just multiply the force by the moment arm. So in this case, torque is Newton meters, right? So if it's 1 meter, if this force is acting at a distance of 1 meter, that's 1,500 Newton meters, right? And then we have this other 500 Newton reactive force that is acting at a distance of 0.5 meters. So that's 250 Newton meters. You add that to 1,500 Newton meters. So you have 1,750 Newton meters acting in a clockwise direction. So the idea would be here to turn the vaulter over on the back, and then what happens later on in the vault? Which way do they rotate? If you think about what happens later, they usually rotate back over onto their anterior. So the anterior side is facing the ground by the time they go up and over the bar. So there's multiple phases where torques are acting to successfully complete that movement. Okay, so to review, center of gravity or center of mass is the overall point. So around which we have the mass of all body segments equally balanced and distributed. So if it's balanced, that means the net force is equal to 0. That means we're in a static position, like the anatomical position here. The center of gravity is approximately 57% of standing height, or about the level of the umbilicus, depending on how body mass is distributed. So more specifically, the center of gravity from the anatomical position is just anterior to the second sacral vertebrae. So the center of mass or center of gravity can change position depending on how we move. So wherever we have more of our body mass distributed is where the center of gravity goes. The center of gravity can be inside the body, as is the case in the anatomical position, or it can be outside the body. If our bodies are flexed forward, then the overall balance point around which our mass is distributed is then outside the body. So if we hold a weight out to the side, like you see here with the suitcase, and we allow our torso to bend to the side, the center of gravity is going to shift to the right, and then we we activate muscle to keep our posture up so that the center of gravity is in line with our movement base, and that helps us to keep our balance. So the center of gravity will shift to wherever we have the most body mass. So this study done way back in 1955 looked at 8 cadavers and determined the center of mass for each body segment. This is a study that's used a lot in research, especially if you're calculating work. Because with work, we not only want to know how much weight is being lifted, but also the weight of each body segment that's being lifted. So when we did the good morning problem last class period, we talked about the weight of the head, the arms, and the trunk. The head, the arms, and the trunk have a weight that is equal to 68% of our total weight. And so then we calculated the moment arm from the hip joint for the head, the arms, and the trunk all together. So this study looked at the location of the center of gravity, and so we can see just a couple examples here. For the upper arms, 57.7% from the shoulder. Okay, so we would go between the shoulder joint and the elbow joint, and a little less than half of the distance. So a little less than half the distance would be where you'd have most of the mass of the upper arms. Let's see, so 57.7%, so that's a little over half. So I misspoke, 57.7%. And then the relative mass, so the percentage of mass for each of these segments that makes up the entire body. So your upper arms make up 5.42% of your total body mass. Another example, so the thighs. Okay, so you're talking about the femur from the hip to the knee joint. So the center of mass would be 41.0% from the hip. So in this case, it would not half, but it'd be closer. The center of mass would be closer to the hip versus the knee joint. The shanks. So that's just the lower leg. The shank is the lower leg. And so that's 44.6% from the knee joint. So from the knee going down, not halfway to the ankle, but less than half, because you've got the gastrocnemius that is concentrated closer to the knee joint. And so going from the knee joint to the ankle joint, less than half of the distance is where you have the center of mass for that specific segment. Okay, so does this make sense? Okay. All right. Okay, so just an example of a high jumper and how the center of mass can actually be underneath the bar if both sides of the body are relatively distributed on each side of the bar. Okay, so this is going to be probably the key practice problem from this chapter. This will come up again when we get back from spring break. So let's read through this and then we'll work on it together. So a weightlifter has mistakenly placed a 20 kilogram plate on the right. Okay, so a 20 kilogram plate is 45 pounds. On the right end, okay, so that's right here, of a barbell, and a 15 kilogram plate on the left end of a barbell. So the 15 kilogram plate is 35 pounds, and that's over here. So you have a 45 pound here and a 35 pound here. Anybody done that other than me? Yeah. Okay. So that's unequal. That's torque, right? Okay. So eventually, if you put enough weight on one side, what's going to happen? It's going to tip over. Okay. So the barbell is a standard Olympic barbell 2.2 meters long, and has a mass of 20 kilograms. So 45-pound standard Olympic barbell, 2.2 meters long, without the plates on it. The 20 kilogram plate is located 40 centimeters from the right end of the barbell. Okay, so what we're going to do is set this point as the axis. So that's our point from which we define our moment arms. So the right end of the barbell where this circle is, that's the rotation point. And we could choose this side too. We'd get exactly the same answer, but for this example, we're just going to say it's on the right side. Okay, so 20 kilogram plate is located 40 centimeters from the right end of the barbell, and the 15 kilogram plate is located 40 centimeters from the left end of the barbell. So 40 centimeters here, and then from the left end of the barbell, it'd be 40 centimeters here. Okay, where is the center of gravity of the barbell with the weight plates on it? So the axis is on the right end. Okay, now we're going to make this easier because how do we calculate weight? If I want to know the weight of something in newtons, how do I calculate that? Mass multiplied by what? Yeah, gravity, which is what? 9.81, right? So because 9.81 is the same, it's uniform, it's constant, we're just going to take that out because we don't need 9.81. That's just going to make the numbers bigger and the math more complicated. So all we're going to use is the mass multiplied by the moment arm to get torque. Does that make sense? So we're just taking 9.81 out. You could do it that way, you get the same answer, but 9.81 is constant, so we'll just take that out, and we'll just use mass multiplied by the moment arm. Okay, so let's set this up. So here's our equation to set this up. So the sum of torque created by each of the component weights, okay, so we're taking the sum of 1, 2, 3 in this case, because we've got a 20 kilogram plate, a 15 kilogram plate, and then we've got the barbell. All right, so that's 1, 2, and 3. So the sum of torque created by each of the component weights, in this case it's 3, okay, equals the torque created by the total weight stacked at the center of gravity location. So equals the torque of the total amount of weight stacked at the center of gravity location. So we're taking the sum of each component, and then if I wanted to solve for the center of gravity, how would I do that? Just with algebra, you would divide the sum of torques by the sum of the weight, right? Okay, so let's set this up. So you're going to have a parentheses number 1. Let's make this the 20 kilogram plate on the right side. So again, we're taking out 9.81, so we're just using mass. So it'd be 20 kilograms, and then how far is that 20 kilogram plate from the right end? 40 centimeters. But to calculate torque, what do we have to do with centimeters?
Meters.
Yeah, convert it to meters. So 0.4 meters is equal to 40 centimeters. So you're going to have 20 kilograms multiplied by 0.4 meters. That's going to be your first right here. So let's get the next plate after that. So the other plate has a mass of how much? 15, right? And how far is it from the left end of the barbell? 0.4. But where's our axis? On the right end of the barbell. So can you do the math quickly and just determine how far from the right end of the barbell is the plate on the left side? 1.8 meters. Or no, it's 180 centimeters. Yeah, so 1.8 meters is correct. Thank you. So you're going to have 15 kilograms times 1.8 meters. And then our third component would just be the bar itself, right? So that's 20 kilograms. Where's the center of the bar? If the bar has a uniform consistency, is 2.2 meters long, then the center is 1.1 meters, right? So 20 kilograms multiplied by 1.1 meters. So in this particular problem, there are three parts. So we have one plate that is 0.4 meters from the right end, 20 kilograms times 0.4. We have a 15 kilogram plate that is 1.8 meters from the right end. And then we have the bar itself that has a mass of 20 kilograms multiplied by its center, which is 1.1 meters from the right side of the barbell. Okay, so you have these three components, and then what is the sum? And again, we're taking 9.81 out, so we can just use kilograms, we get the same answer. If you add the kilograms of each of those three components, what do you get? So you have 20 plus 20 plus 15 is 55, right? 55 kilograms. So again, it says W there, but we're taking 9.81 out, so we're just using the mass. Make it easier. So the sum of the mass is 55 kilograms. And then if we're using mass, then torque is going to be kilogram meters, not Newton meters, kilogram meters. So how many kilogram meters do you get by adding up the component torques? Good job. 57 kilogram meters. And if you divide 57 kilogram, well, it's kilogram because we're not using 9.81. So 57 kilogram meters divided by 55 gives you what for your center of gravity location? 1.04 meters. From which end of the barbell? From the right. So let's go back. Okay, so look at the scenario. We got a lighter plate here, a heavier plate here, the center of the barbell here. So if you have a heavier plate, what would you expect the center of gravity of the barbell to be? It's going to shift a little bit in the direction where you have the heavier plate. So the center is 1.1 meters, and because we have this heavier plate, the center of gravity shifts in that direction, so now it's 1.04 meters from the right side of the barbell. So any questions on how to do that? So 57, and we're using kilograms versus newtons because we didn't use 9.81. So 57 kilogram meters comes from adding the component torques. So 20 times 0.4, 15 times 1.8, 20 times 1.1. And then dividing by the sum of the mass, the 55. Got it? Okay. Okay, so if I asked you something like this, maybe with 5 or 6 different plates, it'd be the exact same process. So as long as you know where the axis is at, and that will be defined, probably just the right side, you could work the problem with the axis on the left and you'd get the same answer. So the next exam, you'd be expecting it. There's going to be a problem when we do chapters 5 and 6 exam, not on Wednesday, where you'll have more plates, more components. You just take each component, yes?
Is there going to be
in this case, you can use either one because 9.81 is constant. So that's just the easy approach. On the exam, you could still use mass, just because it's all not, you'd get the same answer, it's just more numbers. So to make it easy, you can just use mass. Okay, so last part of chapter 5, we're almost done. So total body stabilizing factors. So there's 3 factors that create resistance to rotation. So torque is defined as a force that is applied at a distance from the center or rotation point of an object or body. So there's 3 things that create resistance to torque. First one is weight, just plain old weight. Heavier you are, the greater the interaction, friction you have with the ground creates greater resistance to movement, inertia. The height of the center of gravity. Okay, so as the height of the center of gravity increases, usually the ground is the reference point, your stability decreases. The distance of the center of gravity to the edge of the base of support. So we'll define the base of support. It has to do with the area around the contact point. So the area around your feet, how your feet are positioned, and we'll go over some examples. So first one, so I thought I'd make this a little bit more interesting, a little bit of history here with sports. So 1985 Chicago Bears, been a few documentaries on that. Some think it was the greatest team ever. I was actually around at that time, was a fan at that time. So William the Refrigerator Perry scored a touchdown in the Super Bowl. It was against the New England Patriots that year in January of 1986. It was kind of a blowout. It was like 55-10 that game. So his Super Bowl ring size was the largest of any professional football player in the history of the event. His ring size was 25. So at his size, he was also very, very fast. So he was close to 400 pounds, but he was very, very quick, and they used him a lot on running plays, especially the goal line. Okay, so the second factor, the height of the center of gravity. So the height of your center of gravity depends on where your mass is concentrated relative to the ground. So a lot of the greatest running backs of all time, a lot of people think Barry Sanders was. He had tree trunk legs, and so a lot of his mass was concentrated very close to the ground because of the large quadriceps that he had. So a center of gravity that is closer to the ground is going to be very hard to knock off balance. It's going to be very hard to bring down. So a lot of the greatest running backs are built the same way. So they're very hard to knock off balance because their center of gravity is close to the ground. Okay, so in a mechanical sense, the last factor is the distance of the center of gravity relative to the edge of the base of support. So think of the base of support like this. So the center of gravity for this shape is here. So we draw a line straight down, and then to the edge of the base of support, B for base of support. Okay, so it depends on which direction the force is coming from. So this is a toppling force, capital P, toppling force. And so if this force is applied, eventually that center of gravity is going to fall outside the base of support, at which point that object will topple, it'll fall over. So the greater the distance of the center of gravity to the edge of the base of support, the greater the stability. So we haven't changed the shape, we've just changed the direction of the toppling force. So now you can see less distance before the center of gravity would fall outside the base of support, and the object would tip over then. So we can apply this to human movement. So which of these positions would be more stable? Yeah, because you have a greater distance before the center of gravity would fall outside the base of support versus the stance on this side. So the base of support can take on lots of different shapes depending on the points that are in contact and the distance between the feet. You can see several sport-specific examples, 4-point stance versus 3-point stance. Ballerinas have to have tremendous strength in their feet and also their core because they're balancing over a very limited base of support. So the center of gravity has very little amount it can move before balance would be lost. Okay, so another question for you. So why move the center of gravity closer to the edge of the base of support? So in a sport like swimming, where you're in this position waiting for that starting gun to go off, you want stability. Why would you move your center of gravity just as close as you can without letting your center of gravity fall outside the base of support where you would fall? Less to overcome, yeah, okay. What else? You want to get out of there fast, right? So the less stable you are, the faster you're going to be able to initiate motion out of that position. So in certain cases where the idea is to get out of a position as quickly as possible, you want less stability. So you're going to, of course, practice getting that center of gravity just far enough where you can maintain for a short period of time without falling over and false starting. So it's dependent on the sport, how much stability you want in different contexts. Okay, so do you have any questions over chapter 5? So let's shift our focus because you won't be tested on chapter 5 till after spring break. But I want to make sure that we review concepts from chapters 3 and 4. So let's look over this, have a discussion, then we'll end for today. So let's talk about concepts from chapter 3. So make sure you bring a calculator. There will be some problems. You'll be given the formulas, but this is on the concepts. So chapter 3, Newton's laws. So can an object or body be in motion if no net external force is acting on it? So let's talk about that. So that's which of Newton's laws would apply there. First, yes. So the first, sometimes called the law of inertia. So an object or body will stay in motion at a constant velocity or it will remain at rest unless acted upon by a net external force. So if all the forces are in balance, okay, then there's not going to be any motion. Or an object will have a constant state of motion, so it won't speed up or slow down or change direction. So the answer is yes. The object would continue moving at a constant velocity until the net external force is not equal to 0. And then you'll have a change in velocity due to the acceleration. Okay, so number 2, can two external forces act on an object or body and not cause acceleration? What do you think? Yeah, so that's just kind of an extension of the first one. If the forces are equal and in opposite directions, then the object or body will still be in equilibrium. Net force is equal to 0. And so there will be no change in the state of motion. Okay, so number 3, when you turn a corner while walking, what force causes you to change directions, and where does this force act on you? So a change of direction is considered an acceleration. So how well does your car change direction if there's an icy road? So it's friction, right? It's friction between the ground and the soles of your feet that causes a change in direction. Okay, so number 4, show how Newton's first law of motion can be derived from Newton's second law of motion. So Newton's first law, the net force is equal to what? Newton's first law, all the forces are balanced, so the net force is equal to 0. Okay, Newton's second law, what do we call Newton's second law? Sometimes called the law of acceleration, right? So first law is law of inertia, second law is law of acceleration when the net force is no longer equal to 0. So that's the difference, is Newton's first law, the net force is equal to 0. Newton's second law, the net force is no longer equal to 0. So that's what produces an acceleration. So how do we calculate, or what's the mathematical expression of Newton's second law? The net force is equal to what two things multiplied together? So for Newton's second law, what's the mathematical expression? So the net force is equal to mass multiplied by acceleration. So F equals ma. F has to be a net force. So what can we say about the net force and acceleration then, if mass is constant? The greater the net force, the greater the acceleration, right? With a constant mass. So force and acceleration are proportional. Okay, so when you're lifting a weight upward, the weight often feels heavier near the beginning of the lift and lighter near the end of the lift, especially if the lift is done quickly. Why? So this goes back to the bathroom scale and elevator example. So what is the net force is dependent on two different parts. So if we look at weightlifting in terms of net force, you have the force that you apply to the bar, but what other force have you got that's opposing your force? Gravity, which is what acts on the mass of the bar, which we define as weight, right? So you got weight and you have your reactive force from your muscles. So the weight acts down, and in reaction to that, your muscles produce an upward force. So to get the weight moving up, how would the weight and reactive force compare? Which one would be greater in order to get the weight moving up?
Reactive.
Yeah, reactive force would have to be greater, right? So the net force would have to be positive. The positive reactive force overcomes the negative force of gravity or weight. So because reactive force is greater, that's why the weight feels heavier near the beginning. Because reactive force is greater than weight, the weight feels heavier near the beginning. What about the end? The end of the lift. Getting to the end of the lift feels lighter, so the reverse scenario would be true. Now weight is greater than R. Okay, R is a reactive force. So the weight is undergoing deceleration or negative acceleration, and so that's why it would feel lighter. Is the reverse is true. Weight is greater than R. Okay, so the weight of the average NFL player increased by 10% in 20 years. Describe the mechanical advantage that a heavy player has over a lighter player. So let's take this in terms of Newton's second law. So force equals mass times acceleration. So for a given amount of force, so two players collide, a given amount of impact force is going to have a greater effect on a player with lighter mass versus heavier mass. A player with more mass versus less mass.
We'd have more friction, right?
Yes, yeah, certainly more stability, which would be part of the reason why an impact would have less effect on a heavier player because of greater friction. So a given force will have less effect on a player with less mass versus more mass. Okay, last question from chapter 3. So Mike and Pete's team are in a tug of war contest. Mike's team pulled harder initially. So Mike's team pulled harder initially. But now Pete's team, the rope, and Mike's team are all moving with a constant velocity in the direction of the pulling force from Mike's team. So constant velocity would be the key there. Which team is pulling with greater force on the rope at this instant? So if it's constant velocity, is there a net force?
No.
No. Net force is equal to what?
0.
0. So at that very instant, the net force is 0. So neither team is pulling with greater force. It's moving along at a constant velocity. But Mike's team pulled harder initially, which is why the constant velocity is in that direction. Okay, so we're ready to move on to chapter 4. Okay, all right, so let's take chapter 4. Okay, so as velocity increases, is there a proportional increase in stopping distance? That is, if you double your velocity, does your minimum stopping distance also double? Explain. Okay, so what's the formula for kinetic energy? Remember? That's potential energy, gravitational potential energy. What about kinetic energy? Yes, 1/2 mass times velocity squared. So if we look at the work-energy relationship, what does work equal to? You have a net force acting over a displacement, right? So force times displacement, force acting over a given displacement brings kinetic energy to 0. So it's that work-energy relationship. Now, do some quick math for me. Let's just set mass equal to 1 kilogram. Mass is equal to 1 kilogram, and let's say an object is moving along at 2 meters per second. So quickly calculate for me what the kinetic energy would be. If mass is equal to 1 kilogram and velocity is equal to 2 meters per second, what would your kinetic energy be in joules? Yes, it would be 2 joules, right? So mass is equal to 1 kilogram, velocity is equal to 2 meters per second. Your joules would be 2, right? Because 2 squared is 4, divided by 2, or multiplied by 0.5 is 2, so 2 joules. Okay, so remember that number, 2 joules. What if we doubled, like in this question, what if we doubled the velocity? So we're going from 2 meters per second to 4 meters per second now. So at 2 meters per second, a 1 kilogram mass has 2 joules of kinetic energy. At 4 meters per second, a 1 kilogram mass has how much kinetic energy? 8 joules. So if we double the velocity, we are quadrupling the kinetic energy, right? So looking back at the work-energy relationship, if we double velocity from 2 meters per second to 4 meters per second, and we keep the force the same, the stopping distance is also going to quadruple. So work-energy relationship. So if we keep the force the same, and we double the velocity, because kinetic energy quadruples, we went from 2 joules to how many? 8. So a 4-fold increase in kinetic energy. If the force is kept the same, the stopping distance has to increase by 4 as well. So you'd have a 4-fold increase in stopping distance if you double velocity because of kinetic energy. So velocity, because velocity is squared, we double the stopping distance. Does that make sense? Okay, all right. All right, so if you drop so question 9, if you drop a basketball and tennis ball together so that the basketball bounces on the floor and the tennis ball bounces on top of the basketball. So visualize this. So you're dropping a tennis ball and a basketball at the same time so that the basketball bounces on the floor and the tennis ball bounces on top of the basketball. What will happen to the motion of the tennis ball? So this has to do with conservation of momentum. So what has a higher mass, the basketball or tennis ball? Basketball has a higher mass. So in order to conserve momentum, what has to happen to the tennis ball after the collision? Is it going to take on the same velocity as the basketball had just before hitting the floor? Or because of the smaller mass, what has to happen to the velocity of the tennis ball to conserve momentum? So it's a trade-off. Basketball has high mass, less impact velocity. Tennis ball has less mass, but post-impact velocity is going to be higher because momentum is mass times velocity. So if you have a larger mass moving at a slower velocity pre-impact, you're going to have a smaller mass like the tennis ball moving with a higher velocity post-impact if momentum is completely conserved. Okay. So mechanically speaking, how does an airbag protect you against an accident? Explain. So in terms of work and energy, what type of work is an airbag doing on your body? So let's go over work. Positive work, force and displacement in the same direction. Positive work, force and displacement in the same direction. Negative work, force and displacement in opposite directions. So when an airbag deploys, what direction is it applying force on your body? Backwards. What direction is your body tending to go? In the opposite. So an airbag does negative work on your body. Negative work is intended to bring objects or bodies to a stop. So an airbag does negative work because force and displacement are in opposite directions to bring your body to a stop. So it also increases the time over which your body comes to a stop, which lowers the average force. So how is work and impulse related then? They both involve force. What's the difference? Work is displacement. Impulse is what? Time. Yeah. So if there's displacement, there's usually also time. So if you're taking a greater displacement or if you're taking more time, the force component can drop, and that is the safety issue if there's less force. Okay, so mechanically speaking, why is running on loose sand more fatiguing than running on a rubberized track? So it's kind of the same as an airbag. Sand is doing what type of work on your body? The reactive force is towards you, but what direction is your foot still going? opposite the reactive force, right? In other words, the sand is giving a little bit. So you do have some reactive force because you push into the sand and you have a reactive force that acts opposite your push, but because the sand has a little more give to it, your foot moves opposite the reactive force. So the sand does negative work on your feet. What's the coefficient of restitution like for sand versus a rubberized track? Pretty low, right? In other words, are you losing energy or retaining energy? Yeah, you're losing a lot of energy due to the low coefficient of restitution or recovery of energy. Okay, so what advantages might a sprinter with well-designed prosthetic legs have over a sprinter with legs? Prosthetic legs versus normal human legs. Assume prosthetic devices have been optimized for sprinting. So, in a lot of ways, our legs are like springs, okay? Because the tissues, like tendons and muscles and ligaments, they can store energy. So we have, as our foot hits the ground, we have a phase where energy is stored, and then as we push off the ground, we release energy. So in the same way, prosthesis can also store and release energy. With humans, it's not a perfect recovery of energy though. So all the energy that you store during impact is not necessarily recovered during propulsion. So you have an impact phase and a propulsion phase. So you store energy during the impact and then you recover it during the push off or the propulsion phase. So if you're running on prosthetic devices, you may get more recovery of what type of energy do you think? What type would be elastic energy? What's the other word for that? It's a type of potential energy, right? Strain potential energy. So with prostheses, you're getting greater recovery of strain potential energy. So what we try to do with athletes is get them to the point where their legs are storing and recovering more of that energy through stretch, shorten, cycle type movements. So we want the legs to resemble springs as much as possible, where 100% of the energy you store is retained on contraction, right? So what's that time interval between the storage phase and the recovery phase? Yeah, amortization, right? So that's what we do with jump training is we get better at recovering energy that we store during the stretch of muscles and tendons. Okay, so why is a follow-through important in throwing and striking activities? So a baseball pitcher releases the ball, and so at this point, are we doing negative work or positive work? So let's talk about it. Negative work means what for force and displacement? Opposite direction. So you release the ball, it's almost like you're pulling back a little bit. So your muscles are producing force in the direction opposite, but when you release the ball, isn't your arm still moving forward? Yeah, it's moving forward, but what are the muscles doing? Muscles are acting like the brakes on your car, right? They're pulling back. And so the greater the displacement or the greater the follow-through phase, how does that affect the average force that acts on your shoulder? So it's like with impulse. If you have a greater time, force is less. If you dissipate force over greater displacement, the force that acts on your shoulder is also less. So the time over which you do an amount of negative work is much safer on your joints for a follow through. So do you have any questions? Okay, so just bring a calculator, pen or pencil. Come to office hours if you have any other questions. So thank you. I'll see you on Wednesday.